breed like rats, and you're no fucking better.
Bertrand Russell is heralded as a philosophical hero. Born on the 8th of May of 1872, he was an English philosopher, logician, mathematician, and public intellectual. He influenced mathematics, logic, set theory, and various areas of analytic philosophy. He is described by the Wikipedia not only as a prominent philosopher and public intellectual, but furthermore as a moral exemplar, a pioneer of a revolutionary progressive ideals, and a defender of world peace. Here is a quote from the Wikipedia. Russell was a pacifist who championed anti-imperialism and chaired the England-based India League. He went to prison for his pacifism during the First World War, and he initially supported appeasing Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany before changing his view in 1943, describing war as a necessary lesser of two evils. In the wake of the Second World War, he welcomed American global hegemony in preference to either Soviet hegemony or no or ineffective world leadership, even if it were to come at the cost of using their nuclear weapons. He would later criticize Stalinist totalitarianism, condemn the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War, and become an outspoken proponent of nuclear disarmament. Indeed, when considering the responsibilities philosophers have towards the present, and here is me speaking, no longer Wikipedia, Russell often serves as a model of an intellectual who, instead of remaining in the academic ivory tower, got down to it to help the advancement of humanity. And when considering his philosophical merits, he is broadly recognized as one of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century and a key proponent of the most scientific and modern methodology for correct philosophizing, that is, analytic philosophy. So what if this were an illusion, a veneer for the promoter of ideas that are antithetical to the flourishing of humankind and the earth as a whole? Indeed, what if Russell's influence and popularity are a deliberate consequence of his embeddedness within a system that has produced the current state of technocratic dystopia and total mind war against Earth's citizens, let alone the crimes against the ancient and venerable discipline of philosophy? What if Russell was the intellectual promoter of the supplantation of philosophy by cybernetics and the devaluation of human being as such? So who was Bertrand Russell, and what were his ideas? In a very interesting piece, Dr. David J. Peterson makes the case for a different image of Russell, one which considers his life, writings, and legacy beyond the propaganda-produced image of him. The piece is based on a monograph revoking the moral order, the ideology of positivism, and the Vienna Circle, which is now impossible to find and has gone out of print. So somebody can get a hold on that book. I would like to read it. So I will read Peterson's article with some occasional cuts. And maybe there are some, not everything I fully agree with, but it is definitely worth reading. So here is a version of Peterson's argument, of Peterson's article. In many ways, what the Englishman Bertrand Russell stood for characterizes the ideas and forces of the 20th century, which have emerged triumphant today. Despite his reputation as a mathematician and philosopher of science, Russell is known primarily for his work as a social philosopher, an advocate of world peace. Depending on your viewpoint, he may have been one of the greatest peacemakers of the epoch or one of its greatest villains. Bertrand Russell was born in 1872. His public career began in 1900 and spanned 7 decades until he died in 1970. He was a primary leader and spokesman for one of the greatest philosophical movements of the early century. This movement consisted of physical and social scientists known as positivists, also known as the Vienna Circle. Bertrand was the grandson of Lord John Russell, a Prime Minister of Great Britain under Queen Victoria. Bertrand's official title was Viscount Amberley, the third Earl Russell. He was also a popular author who wrote on a wide range of topics such as culture, morality, and politics. Russell popularized many of the new scientific currents. One of his most successful books, The ABCs of Relativity, explained Einstein's abstruse propositions about space and time for the layman. What millions of people knew as Einstein's famous theories came from Russell's book. He had a clear and readable style which got right to the heart of an issue. He is often compared as a philosopher to John Dewey, but was a much superior writer. Although all the existent biographies of Russell provide much useful information, they overlook his darker side. The exception is a 1996 book by Raymond Monk, which at least explores a man's highly unstable psychology. The great activist and spokesman for world peace and disarmament was, on closer inspection, something of a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Bertrand lost both father and mother at a very early age. In his 6th year, he was placed in the home of his elderly grandmother. In his autobiography, Russell complains bitterly about the stifling tyranny and repression he endured while living in her home. Unlike his older brother, who rebelled and left home, little Bertie remained her pet, never openly defying his granny. He said he developed an overwhelming rage which, to keep the peace at home, he completely suppressed during his childhood. Whether his grandmother did him any harm is hard to say. However, there is no doubt he developed some serious psychological problems. In his autobiography, he speaks about his plan to commit suicide as an adolescent, a plan which was abandoned when he realized it would mean never learning any more mathematics. Despite his great intellect, he displayed the personality of an iconoclast and misanthrope all his life. The primary motivation of Russell's intellectual effort was the removal of cultural repression, which he attributed to traditional religion. He set his mind to the task of eliminating the influence of Christianity on Western culture. Here is a passage from a letter Russell sent to his friend Gilbert Murray, which gives some insight into his tumultuous state of mind as a young man. Quote, "I have been merely oppressed by the weariness, tedium, and vanity of things lately. Nothing seems worth doing or having done. The only thing that I strongly feel worthwhile would be to murder as many people as possible so as to diminish the amount of consciousness in the world." End of quote. In the same melancholy mood, Russell composed a letter to Lady Ottoline Morrell. Speaking about his inner motivation, he wrote that he has had about all the self-repression he can stand, and his words begin to bring to mind the image of a venomous snake about to lash out at its victim. Quote, "There is a fierce hate in me, a hate that is also a well of life and energy. It would not really be good if I ceased to hate. I used to be afraid of myself and the dark side of my instinct, but now I am not." End of quote. Sexual obsession and lust were a dominant force throughout Russell's life and underpinned to his public advocacy of population reduction and birth control. Lady Ottoline Morrell, Bertrand's longtime lover and confidant, was the wife of Philip Morrell. Russell was a notorious libertine whose multiple marriages never prevented him from satisfying his momentary lusts with whomever was at hand and willing. Russell carried out a long series of such affairs after he walked out on his wife, Alice. With characteristic bluntness, he explained that he left his despondent young wife because he was, quote, "bored and disgusted with her." We could say that, all in all, Bertrand Russell devoted his life to eradicating what is known as the moral order. Nietzsche had pronounced in his writings that God is dead and firmly held that the ethical norms taught by Jesus Christ had emasculated the human race. It was Russell who took Nietzsche's call for the transvaluation of all values, reverting the Judeo-Christian moral order, and lent to that project his respectable credentials as a modern scientific thinker. He put forward a post-Christian moral code for the new scientific era. Here is an excerpt from one of his most influential lectures on one of his favorite subjects, the scientific method. Quote, God and immortality, the central dogma of the Christian religion, find no support in science, but we in the West have come to think of them as the irreducible minimum of theology. No doubt people will continue to entertain these beliefs because they are pleasant, just as it is pleasant to think ourselves virtuous and our enemies wicked. But for my part, I cannot see any grounds for either. I do not pretend to be able to prove that there is no God. I equally cannot prove Satan is a fiction. The Christian God may exist, so might the god of Olympus, ancient Egypt, or Babylon, but no one of these hypotheses is more probable than any other. They lie outside the region of provable knowledge, and there is no reason to consider any of them. End of quote. When he talked of religion, especially Christianity, he referred to it as the fear doctrine. He complained that it represents a human being's normal drives to satisfy innate appetites. It creates deep-seated psychological problems, and it destroys a person's most creative impulses. Russell, like many other ideologues, singled out the Catholic Church, which he believed represses the natural inclinations in mankind, and which he regarded as an implacable enemy of human liberation. Implacable? I don't know. Religion, said Russell, since it has its source in terror, has dignified certain fears and made people think them not disgraceful. In this, it has done mankind a great disservice. End of quote. He described his alternative as follows, quote, we are ourselves the ultimate and irrefutable arbiters of value in the world. Nature is blind and sense has no values. It is we who create value and our desires which confer value. In this realm we are kings. End of quote. Russell's philosophy was positivism, a materialist and atheist school of thought deriving from Comte. Russell was the chief mentor of Ludwig Wittgenstein, the famous logician who was a positivist in his early years. Prominent positives such as Sir Karl Popper, Rudolf Carnap, and free market economist F. A. von Hayek all paid homage to Russell for their education and training in the scientific method. Russell's last important scientific project was his Theory of Knowledge, a 3-volume work that attempted to unite all scientific theories into one simple framework so as to liberate science forever from assumptions about God and creation. He wanted to use this revolutionary framework as the acid test of scientific credibility. His opponents, who were religious believers, would then be exposed as charlatans, superstitious fools whose methodology made anything they published and said suspicious and unreliable. The striking thing about Russell is not so much that he, like Nietzsche, wanted to rewrite the moral code of society and produce a transvaluation of all values. The striking thing is that Russell was so successful. The obvious question is why? I would suggest 6 reasons. 1. He was a member of the Coefficients, the dining club that brought together the highest levels of the English elite for discussions and debates. 2. He was one of the most popular writers in the English-speaking world. 3. He was a prominent lecturer at prestigious institutions such as the University of Chicago, Harvard, and the London School of Economics. 4. He was an associate of a prominent group of futurist authors, for example Aldous Huxley and H.G. Wells. 5. He was a United Nations activist working through his own parallel institution, the Pugwash Conference for World Disarmament. 6. In an epoch obsessed with fear of an imminent nuclear war, Russell archived worldwide acclaim as a pacifist, anti-war activist, and disarmament spokesman. For these reasons, Russell proved very successful over a long career in applying most of his social doctrines. Certainly, he did not invent immorality and sin, but he played an indispensable role in promoting the credo of the culture of death. Russell had an elaborate and comprehensive program for social reform. Many observers are astonished at how pervasive its provisions are today. To illustrate, we will look at 4 of his key tenets: sexual liberation and the destruction of the nuclear family, social control through the means of psychology, and the use of addictive and psychotropic drugs, one world government, and population control. Russell played a seminal role as one of the 20th century earliest and most prominent spokesmen for all these endeavors. Bertrand's immediate family was involved in the sexual freedom movement of the 60s. In this case, it was the 1860s. It seems that in 1868, Lord Amberley Russell, Bertrand's father, failed to retain his seat in the House of Lords, in part because his outspoken advocacy of contraception created considerable outrage in Victorian England. The younger Russell spoke out incessantly about his own views in favor of sexual promiscuity. For example, quote, "Certain forms of sex which do not lead to children are at present punished by the criminal law. This is purely superstitious. The peculiar importance attached at the present to adultery is quite irrational. Moral rules ought not to be such as to make instinctive happiness impossible." End of quote. Russell pioneered the idea of an open marriage so that sexual lust could be satisfied at the same time that children are being raised. He advocated programs that would give all children education, sex education, and he was also adamant that early sexual initiation and continued sexual promiscuity for children was an indispensable emotional health measure necessary to counteract what he called the effects of unnatural repression of the child's strongest impulses, which is both cruel and dangerous. At puberty, said Russell, the elements of an unsuperstitious sexual morality ought to be taught. Boys and girls should be taught that mutual inclination justifies sexual intercourse, and, quote, "they should also be taught methods of birth control so as to ensure that children shall only come when they are wanted. The increase of human happiness to be expected from sex education on these lines is immeasurable." End of quote. Much of Russell's obsession about too many births linked contraception and abortion as important new advances to achieve a stable population. He was alarmed about the higher fertility of non-white women, and he demanded that the Asian and black birth rate be drastically curtailed. Otherwise, he felt his own breed, whites, would be overwhelmed, resulting in chaos and disaster. His view on population was made clear in his prospects for industrial civilization. Quote, "Population must be stationary or nearly so. The white population of the world will soon cease to increase. The Asiatic races will be longer, and the Negroes still longer, before their birth rate falls sufficiently to make their numbers stable without the help of war and pestilence. Until that happens, the less prolific races will have to defend themselves against the more prolific." End of quote. An early eugenicist, Russell was one of the most dignified and reputable names who finalized the plans for a massive post-World War II campaign for world population control. His ideas on population are now cited chapter and verse by the modern stalwarts of the zero population growth movement. To his credit, Russell was straightforward about the movement's actual goals and objectives. In 1951, he warned about the kinds of dangers he saw in the near future. Apparently, the renowned four horsemen of the apocalypse were not having the kind of result he was hoping for. In The Impact of Science on Society, he wrote, quote, "At present, the population of the world is increasing at about 58,000 per diem. War, so far, has had no great effect on this increase, which continued throughout each of the world wars. War has hitherto been disappointing in this respect, but perhaps a bacteriological war may prove more effective. If a Black Death could be spread throughout the world once in every generation, survivors would be free to procreate freely without making the world too full." End of quote. Russell went on, "This state of affairs may be somehow unpleasant, but what of it? Really high-minded people are indifferent to happiness, especially other people's." End of quote. In the absence of a moral code, how can it be expected that people will behave themselves? What if we are faced with social chaos and permanent anarchy? The answer to this question emerged in the wake of Enlightenment and the French Revolution and can be summed up in two words, social control. A society lacking the simplest innovations must of necessity turn to a government that will promote policies of overt and covert social control and manipulation. With this in mind, Russell accurately predicted that the two most important fields of research for the second half of the century would be psychology and physiology. Let's see what he has to offer us in The Impact of Science on Society in this regard. Quote, "What is essential in mass psychology is the art of persuasion. It may be hoped that in time anybody will be able to persuade anybody of anything if he can catch the patient young and is provided by the state with the money and equipment. Then he becomes very specific about what this entails. Quote, Anaxagoras maintained that snow is black, but no one believed him. The social psychologist of the future will have a number of classes of school children on whom they will feign different methods of producing an unshakable conviction that snow is black. Various results would soon be arrived at. First, that the influence of the home is obstructive. Second, not much can be done unless indoctrination begins before age 10. Third, that verses set to music and repeatedly intoned are very effective. Fourth, that the opinion that snow is white must be held to show a morbid taste of eccentricity. But I anticipate it is for future scientists to make these maxims precise and discover exactly how much it costs per head to make children believe that snow is black and how much less it would cost to make them believe it is dark gray." End of quote. One component of Russell's vision for mental health and social control was the discovery and use of hallucinogenic drugs. The idea was a favorite topic among the futurists in the early years of the century. Russell had first suggested that such drugs would be invaluable for social control, and his prestige as a progressive spokesman helped create the climate in which such drugs were investigated and tried both overtly and covertly. There is no doubt that a small group of futurists, including Russell, helped create an inverted moral order in which pharmaceutical and psychological experiments were carried out on young subjects, most of them unwitting, using LSD, peyote, mescaline, and other psychedelic drugs. Such experiments were, in result, the catalyst for the Age of Aquarius. Novelist Aldous Huxley outlined the prospects of such drugs in Brave New World. He proceeded to initiate a network of drug researchers and aficionados that included Timothy Leary, Ken Casey, and Jerry Garcia. Their efforts to inaugurate the psychedelic revolution are the subject of Tom Wolfe's classic, The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. There we meet up with the merry pranksters Casey Little Circle, who worked with Garcia and the aptly named band The Grateful Dead, dispensing large doses of LSD and mescaline to thousands of teenagers. For a high percentage of youngsters, along with liberation came drug addiction and, for some, death. Russell won his greatest renown for his long service as an activist for world peace. During World War I, Russell described himself as a pacifist and was jailed in England for his anti-war speeches. Later, his reputation was as, quote, peacemaker for his generation suffered severe damage when, in the early years of the Cold War, Russell signed on as an avid backer of the so-called Baruch Plan. The proposal was billed as a peace offer to the Russians, but it might be better described as a bomb hidden in a care package. Under the plan, Stalin would be given an ultimatum. The Soviets could join an international peace agency and forgo developing an H-bomb, but if they refuse, Moscow and the other major Russian population centers would be instantly obliterated by a nuclear bombardment. In his defense, Russell told the BBC interviewer, "I thought the Russians would give way, but you can't threaten unless you're prepared to have your bluff called." Certainly, this English aristocrat and intellectual was not the only voice that could be heard recommending a preemptive nuclear attack against the Soviets, but he was by far the most prominent pacifist to do so. Some years later, when he was faced with the publication in a New York newspaper of the charge that he had, quote, decided that it would be good morals and good politics to start dropping bombs on Moscow, end of quote, Russell contracted a convenient case of amnesia and vehemently denied that he had ever countenanced any such thing. By the opening of the inaugural meeting of the Pugwash Conference in 1957, Cold War realpolitik had changed considerably and the Baruch Plan was buried. Russian scientists had developed a Soviet version of the ultimate weapon of mass destruction, and just as suddenly, Russell experienced a change of heart. Miraculously, his former mortal enemies, the Soviets, were now his partners in world peace. Anti-communism had dissolved in favor of Russell's new crusade for world peace and nuclear disarmament. Pugwash proposals were imbued with the ideology of the British Fabian Society, calling for a world government made up of the world's elites to enforce a global peace. The plan called for NATO and the Warsaw Pact to be partners in halting the spread of nuclear weapons. The Pugwash Plan, however, went far beyond megatonnage and delivery systems. All nuclear energy and technology were to be centralized in the hands of the existing nuclear states, America, Britain, and Russia. Now, this is what I would read from the article, and I recommend everybody read the article by themselves because it is a very interesting read. One of the things that are not sufficiently developed in the article, it's probably more developed in the book, is the connections between Russell and the Fabian Society. According to the Wikipedia, the Fabian Society is a British socialist organization whose purpose is to advance the principles of social democracy and democratic socialism via gradualist and reformist effort in democracies rather than by revolutionary overthrow. It was historically related to some of the furthest left factions of radicalism, a left-wing liberal tradition. Now, the interesting thing about the Fabian Society is that originally the coat of arms of the Fabian Society was a wolf in sheep's clothing. And this was meant to represent how they would introduce these ideas covertly, being introduced to. Among other prominent Fabians or early Fabians, we have George Bernard Shaw, who shared with Russell the idea that eugenics should be implemented in an industrialized society. Shaw writes, "The only fundamental and possible socialism is the socialization of the selective breeding of man." Later, according to a Guardian article from 1997, he mused that, quote, "the overthrow of the aristocrat has created the necessity for the Superman." That same article says, "The reverend pacifist, disarmer and philosophical titan Bertrand Russell dreamed up a wheeze that would have made even Nazi Germany's eugenicists blush. He suggested that the state should issue color-coded procreation tickets. Those who dared breed with holders of a different color ticket would face a heavy fine. That way, the high-caliber gene pool of the elite would not be muddied by any proletarian or worse, foreign muck." End of quote. Even the Wikipedia at the end of the section of education quotes something from Russell's book Scientific Technique in an Oligarchy that can be made exemplary for the kind of technocratic dystopia requiring a degree of social and psychological control that is now no longer a Fabian dream, but rather a reality that we are all living under. So he says, "In future, such failures are not likely to occur where there is dictatorship. Diet, injections, and injunctions will combine from a very early age to produce the sort of character and the sort of beliefs that the authorities consider desirable, and any serious criticism of the powers that be will become psychologically impossible. Even if all are miserable, all will believe themselves happy, because the government will tell them they are so." End of quote. Now, before ending, we can consider two objections. First, Russell was a pacifist. He opposed war. That is a good thing. But did he really oppose war? His opposition to war is rather an excuse for the justification of the centralization of power into a single world government. Now, credit where credit is due. At the end of his life, Russell did critique the crimes of Israeli Zionism, for example. Here we have a quote. "We are frequently told that we must sympathize with Israel because of the suffering of the Jews in Europe at the hands of the Nazis. I see in this suggestion no reason to perpetuate any suffering. What Israel is doing today cannot be condoned, and to invoke the horrors of the past to justify those of the present is gross hypocrisy. Not only does Israel condemn the vast number of refugees to misery, not only are many Arabs under occupation condemned to military rule, but also Israel condemns the Arab nations only recently emerging from colonial status to continued impoverishment as military demands take precedence over national development." So that is, end of quote, that is rather a good thing, and it seems to me Russell is right in saying that what Israel is doing today cannot be condoned, and to invoke the horrors of the past to justify those of the present is gross hypocrisy. But even then, he subordinated those critiques to the agenda of a centralized global authority that would keep Israeli expansionist thirsts and their genocidal thirsts in line. He said, "All who want to see an end to bloodshed in the Middle East must ensure that any settlement does not contain the seeds of future conflict. Justice requires that the first step towards a settlement must be an Israeli withdrawal from the territories occupied in June 1967. A new world campaign is needed to help bring justice to the long-suffering people of the Middle East." So the second objection is that Russell was a great philosopher who advanced the development of mathematical logic, so we should not consider him on his merit solely on his political writings, even if those are scary or whatever. We should consider him in his merits as an advancer of the only legitimate form of philosophy today. But what if analytic philosophy, or at least Russell's version of it, is in fact the main direct contributor to the fall of the genuine exploration of truth by the means of thinking, a thinking that does not see itself reduced to a single paradigm of meaning such as classical logic? What if the classical logic version of philosophical methodology, along with the prejudice of scientism, have in fact flattened out meaning such that genuine philosophy is no longer possible? And what if it is not by chance but by design that this pseudo model of thought is now the only institutionally accepted form of doing philosophy in contemporary universities, or at least any universities that have any international or national prestige, with the few outliers being progressively expelled, segregated, or relegated to the humiliating labels of history of ideas, comparative literature, or the supremely undignified cultural studies? So, here is the conspiracy. Bertrand Russell, instead of being a philosophical hero and promoter of world peace, is an agent of both genocide and logocide, the devaluation of human life for the sake of a technocracy ruled by an intellectual elite of like-minded peers, and the devaluation of genuine human thinking for the sake of efficiency-based cybernetics. Thank you very much for listening to this, and if you enjoyed, I am happy about it.
Too many fucking humans! You breed like rats! And you're no fucking better! Human! You breed like rats! And you're no fucking better!